Where is the camp? Psychiatry and the state of exception. Italian theory is the hottest thing in contemporary philosophy, and Giorgio Agamben is one of its hottest figures. His writing on the state of exception, bare life, the homo sacer, and the camp have helped to frame in theory some of the most problematic aspects of the contemporary political world. Agamben's theory is thick, and I will only very softly enter it here. But I want to seize at least upon of its few core concepts and claims to situate one more problematic aspect of that political world. To apply theory here among action, strategy, solution professionals acting in an action, strategy, solution-oriented world is a tenuous proposition. But I agree with Zizek here. There's nothing more urgent than to think, to stop doing and to think, and nothing more useful than good theory. The problem I want to situate, of course, is the, quote, treatment of psychiatrized persons judged, for any of an extraordinary variety of reasons, to pose offenses grave enough to the social order to warrant, let us say, special treatment that exempts them from the society's ordinarily regnant legal order and excises them from the fabric of its ordinary socio-ethical contract. In the most basic and brutal of portraits, the specialness of this special treatment consists in the forcible capture and encaging of socially deviant persons. It consists in their quarantine in spaces where their illicit appearance cannot threaten the society's aesthetic integrity, and their original behaviors cannot threaten its discipline. It consists in their subjection in those spaces of containment to acts that are incontrovertibly violent. We can, of course, argue about the justifiability or unjustifiability of that violence, but it is impossible to refute the violence per se, and their subjection to this violence is also, of course, the mold either for their desubjectification, that is, for their disappearance from the community of persons, or for their resubjectification, that is, for their reconfiguration in accord with the social norm and their return to the society as a refurbished human good. When I call this treatment special, I do want you to shiver with the unsettling connotations of that term. But I also want you to recognize the true exceptionality of this special treatment from everything we understand to be the society or the community. I want you to recognize that when we speak of the psychiatric practices invoked, arbitrary internment and confinement, carceral securitization, military-grade surveillance, sensory deprivation, pharmaceutical docilification, forcible drugging and feeding, discretionary bodily violation, we are speaking of practices that cannot be executed on persons. Persons, a term we'll return to later. For Agamben, the state of exception is an anomic space in which what is at stake is the force of law without law. It is a legally invoked suspension or withholding of the law, at once inside the law and outside the law, included in the law through its very exclusion. And who declares the state of exception? The sovereign declares it. This is to say that sovereignty, law, and violence are inseparably twined. I will promise not to bore you here with too much theory, but I want to introduce a few concepts more that take up a central role in Agamben's intellectual project, concepts that I think can help us to understand the character and consequence of the psychiatric state of exception. First, bare life. Recall the distinction between the Greek zoe and bios that gets lost in the English life. Zoe is life itself, the life belonging to any living organism, the quality of being alive. Bios is political life, qualified life, life in the polis. In plain, if too simplistic terms, we can think of zoe as that life proper to animals, and bios as that life proper to persons, life as such. Bare life, then, points roughly to zoe, to life itself, life devoid of any qualification that we, people, assume as persons. The homo sacer, and this is the last concept I want to introduce, is, let us say, the exemplar figure of bare life. In ancient Roman law, homo sacer, sacred man, was an obscure figure whose name relates to the historical meaning of sacred, set apart, whose condemnation meant that he could be legally killed but not legally sacrificed. In other words, he is placed outside the society's legal order and also outside the divine order. He is beyond law, abandoned. He is ejected from the polis and hence has no claim on bios, but neither does he enjoy the protections of the gods. His is bare life. The difference between these two terms is subtle but significant. While bare life is the condition of a life that is fully and exclusively zoe, atavistic par excellence, homo sacer is the condemned figure who has been reduced from bios to zoe, from political life, life in the polis, life in the society, to bare life. This is a deprivation, a degradation, a demotion. These ideas become easier to think about if we put them in more familiar terms. Two of the troublesome contemporary spaces and contexts that thinkers readily recognize as approximations of a state of exception are the American prison camps at Guantanamo and the refugee camps at, now throughout Europe and also the United States. Indeed, the ultimate example is the camp par excellence, the apparatus of Nazi concentration camps and all that went into its possibilization and realization. Here we have an exceptional space that withdrew ordinary law and at the same time declared into legal being, a new order whose order had nothing to do with ordinary law and everything to do with the command of the sovereign. Let's be careful then not to confuse exceptionality with illegality. Alas, the problem with exceptionality is precisely that exception from the law is legally administered. Now we can begin to arrive at our own interests. Agamben theorizes that, in the modern order, the state of exception has lost the exceptionality its name describes, and instead, as Benjamin proclaimed, become the rule. The state of exception has become so normalized and so diffuse, according to Agamben, that it no longer requires even a declaration as such. The camp is the very nomos of the modern. Yes, the world's pretension of pinnacling Hegelian progress, of freedom, justice, democracy, and so on, are superfluous, and the violence and abandon that define the camp are always more substantively and surreptitiously a part of our order. Now I have framed this paper with a titular question. Where is the camp? I would like to propose that we find it in carceral psychiatry, by which I mean, of course, psychiatry that plies its trade by collecting and enclosing people, carcer, enclosed space. Here we have a system that, 1, is exceptional, that operates as an exception to the ordinary law, 2, that is commanded into being, in practice at least, by the sovereign-playing psychiatrist, and that subsequently turns upon his arbitrary declaration, and 3, that sacralizes its human subject-object. Let's look at these. First, is forced psychiatry really exceptional, in the Agambenian sense? Certainly it is substantively exclusive at a straightforward level, excluding the person, physically, socially, culturally, economically, morally, from the society. I think it is also procedurally exemptive, withdrawing from him the protections of the society's ordinary law. I cannot round up Mary because she has brown eyes, or John because he sports an unfashionable haircut, although, we did until not too many years ago have a host of ugly laws on the books. But I can round up and enclose indefinitely Jane because she is too skinny and Joe because he talks to himself. And if I round up Bill, say, because I think he has stolen a Cadillac, I must provide evidence that he has indeed stolen the Cadillac, and I must convince a jury of his peers that my evidence is credible enough to warrant Bill's punishment by enclosure. And if I am able to convince them and Bill is in fact enclosed, well, at least there is some defined penalty corresponding to the severity of that crime, and there is some defined limit as to how long I may enclose him. But if I have rounded up Jane because she is too skinny, or Joe because he talks to himself, I do not need to provide evidence. I need only to write. It is my expert opinion that Jane is anorexic or Joe is suicidal, and the burden of justification for their enclosure is satisfied. And while some of this exceptionality is the product of praxis that deviates too much from logos, and that itself is no small problem, much of it lives at the foundational level of the logos itself. This is the great unless, or the great except, that we find throughout mental health law. Psychiatrization often accepts its subject-object also from the the body of rights-insisting international law that the global community of persons has called common to all humans, common and so fundamental to human being in the world that they name these rights as inderogable, inviolable. Sometimes this exception is quite explicit. Asterisk does not apply here, reservation to the convention, justification X. And sometimes it is with a flourish of discursive gymnastics. Treatment is torture, deprivation of liberty is protection in a place of safety, and so on. But enclosure in a room separated by 5 keyed doors from even the nearest entrance into fresh air, much less into the world we thought we lived in, is deprivation of liberty, whether we label it a detention camp or a prison or a hospital. And forced feeding is torture, whether we do it in Guantanamo or in Broadmoor. There's much more we could reflect on here, and it's surely worthwhile, but for now I'll move on. Second, is this state of exception commanded into being by the sovereign player? In effect, I want to say yes. Sometimes this is strictly true, as in the case of emergency admissions or in jurisdictions that require only a psychiatrist's formalization. But in practice, this is almost always true. Whatever procedural theatrics the enclosure achievement entails is nothing more than this. As I have heard testified to many times during this very Congress, psychiatrists' requests for detention are almost never refused the rubber stamp of the inferior standing social worker or the impossibly busy judge. However nicely the criteria for detention are molded into conformance with the moral requirements of the advanced justice-committed, humane contemporary world, there's no criterion that is more than a word husk, as Illich calls them, a handy container that can be filled with whatever content and supped with whatever meaning the speaker and listener will. Danger to self, danger to others, in need of, last resort. These can be made first and foremost to mean anything. They are second, charged with all the presumption of the speaker, and they are third, wholly contained by whatever ideological axioms determine the horizons of the speaker's possibility for thought. In the end, then, the state of exception is invoked because the psychiatrist, the acting sovereign as it were, declares that Jane or Joe be entered into it. Again, there's much more we might reflect on here, but for now I will move on. Third, finally, and what is for me the crux of the matter, the production of the homo sacer. Another presenter at this Congress used the term social death to describe what happens to the psychiatrized person who is so deprived of participation in the society that he is, well, dead in relation to the pulsing of the social fabric, of the social life, of the community of us. But this is only a small part of the story. The personal death, I will call it, that happens in the extreme conditions of enclosure and torture that can happen in forced psychiatry is incomprehensibly graver. For a person to discover this extra-legal space where law, moral relation, and violence are entangled with procedural and practical inescapability in a way that is, in the realist sense, Kafkaesque, to come face to face with a world that is so arbitrary and so vicious that one simply could not have imagined it before one's own encounter with it, stupefies the entrant precisely with the fact of its extraordinary incredibility. I'm reminded of Ahmedi's amazement. If from the experience of torture any knowledge at all remains that goes beyond the plain nightmarish, it is that of a great amazement and a foreignness in the world that cannot be compensated by any sort of subsequent human communication. Amazed, the tortured person experienced that in this world there can be the other as absolute sovereign, and sovereignty revealed itself as the power to inflict suffering and to destroy. We can read in Levi and Celan and so many other Holocaust writers exactly this amazement, this incomprehensibility that cannot do other than correspond to a wild alienation from the world. There's something else, of course, that Levi, Celan, and Ahmedi have in common, and we should not forget that lesson in the context of our own state of exception. And we can read the impossible descriptions of the Nazi camp Musulmaner, those living dead, those figures of death in life, who inhabit forever a space that is neither here nor there, but a hellish abandonment in the disintegrity of both. these living dead. Ah, and the psychiatric state of exception? I've made this small excursus into Holocaust literature for good reason. It is here and only here that I have been able to find any telling of the sort of knowledge that I have known. It is Ahmadi's amazement. It is the Musulman stupor that I know. Enclosed, disabled, tortured. I can tell you what happened to me. I can tell you that I tumbled, condemned as such, from Bios to Zoe, that I entered the registrar of Levi's non-men, that I exist beneath Santos's abyssal line. But what do these words make you know? I exist, I'm alive, but I am not a person. Burned onto my being, into my being, is a lacquer of horror that clothes the unman. It is the lacquer of horror that clothes the unman. I exist, I am alive, but I am not a person. Burned onto my being is the lacquer of horror that clothes the unman. There are a few scenes from my internment that I remember more than most. One is the worst moment of torture. 5 consecutive forced feedings ravaged my body to foot-high convulsions and gallons of vomit. Afterwards, they deposited this body at the nearest real hospital to be sure that I would not die, which would surely have implied too much paperwork. Parentheses, does the story change for you if I reveal that I am not, and have never been, in fact, anorexic? And does it matter? A second of these etched scenes is the first of 2 tribunals that I stood. It was here I recognized that I was, in the eyes of the law, truly and wholly an unperson, and that I was ownable and owned, and that I could be traded and bargained for and spoken about and referred to, and condemned by the world that I thought had existed, to life locked in a cage, and that there was nothing I could do about it. A third moment is the second tribunal, when the nurse's presentation of manufactured evidence against me hit me like a ton of bricks, when the psychiatrist admitted that I had revealed nothing to suggest a mental illness, but still, in her, quote, expert opinion, I must be anorexic, quote, secretly anorexic, the sneakiest anorexic anyone had ever known. And the judges agreed that the psychiatrist's expert opinion was indeed correct, that the nurse's manufactured evidence was real, that my true claims were the lies of a scheming madwoman. And I, the I who had clung to its subjectivity in whatever in small and degree it had until that moment endured, stared into the face of the Medusa and fell permanently frozen in rocky horror. Or perhaps I can say, with Ahmadi, in amazement. And then I remember the others, the woman whom I never heard speak, but only screech in terror every day as the guards entered her room to brutally force-feed her, whom I never saw except when the guards exited her, always with a new crutch or a new sling, for a journey to the hospital following her most recent battery. And I remember the scenes of a woman slithering down the hall on her belly one night in total desperation. I do not know how long she had left to rot in that hell, but that day marked one too many days. I escaped and fled the country, and I suppose that is the only reason I am here in this room right now. But hell, I think, cannot be escaped. Those are the scenes that return to me every night. Those are the scenes that fill my bed with paralytic terror urine. Those are the scenes that put into wholly new light Derrida's question. Who is this I that can say who? And what happens when the identity of the I trembles? Indeed, what becomes of being itself when the identity of the I as person trembles, or crumbles, or, better said, when it is made to crumble? This is Scary's world unmaking, Ahmadi's utter alienation from the world. It corresponds, I want to say, to Agamben's homo sacer, to Levi's non-men, to the Musulman of the Nazi camps, to all those figures of death and life, of alive and alert nothingness. This is the world to which the worst of psychiatry's victims are excised. I think, then, that we have successfully identified, a state of exception.